complementing new technologies with existing ways of new things offers incredibly new potential for solving endemic problems. For example, from Bangladesh, and this is happening in many countries, mobile phone data is being used to understand migration and distress migration much more accurately than before, because through a mobile phone you can get an understanding of who is moving where. If a cyclone hits a particular area, what happens to migratory patterns, to really make sure that we can design programs and approaches that can help displaced people better in the context of climate change. As the climate crisis worsens, that's also going to have a deleterious impact on migration.
We are living in an era where climate change isn't just a future threat, it's rewriting lives today. But as storms intensify, heat waves scorch cities, and displacement surges, could cutting edge technologies like AI, big data, and even mobile innovations hold the key to smarter, faster solutions? To unpack these questions, I'm joined by Dr. Aditya Bahadur, Director of the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center. Dr. Bahadur is an IPCC contributing author whose work on climate resilience spans 15 years across multiple continents. His book, Resilience Reset, examines innovative approaches to urban resilience in the global south. Today, we'll dive into the real world examples where technology is bridging critical gaps in understanding climate vulnerability, exposure, and hazards. We'll explore the balance between high tech solutions and traditional approaches and discuss how practitioners must embrace these tools while ensuring they reach those most in need. Thank you so much, Aditya, for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Wonderful to be here, Anirudh. Thank you.
Aditya, can we begin this conversation by first understanding that how do you view the role of artificial intelligence in the current climate crisis that's panning out?
Sure, Anirudh. Let me just begin by saying that we are recording this podcast in January 2025. And by all accounts, this is going to be a really pivotal year for climate change for a number of reasons. One is uh, the UK Met Office, one of the world's leading scientific authorities, has underlined how, in all likelihood, this will be the hottest year on record. The other thing that's becoming patently obvious is that in 2025, the fact that we're going to overshoot 1.5 degrees centigrade is going to become a real acknowledged scientific reality. And people are going to reconcile themselves with the fact that now we're heading towards the 2-degree warming world, and that's going to be the new target. With this crossing of this threshold, we will see new and catastrophic, unanticipated climate impacts across the world. Sorry to begin on such a gloomy note, but that's the context in which you're operating, and you can already see hints of that in the crazy LA wildfires that are taking place at the moment. So, we are living in a context where the climate crisis is well and truly upon us. Now, at the same time, as these climate impacts are becoming more acute, the use of new technology, which includes AI, big data, machine learning, natural language uh, processing, platforms, are all becoming a lived reality. And all of us are trying to determine the degree to which we should be incorporating these new approaches to solve the problem of climate change. Um, in my personal opinion, these new technologies have an incredibly high potential to revolutionize adaptation efforts across the world. And through this conversation, I hope to give you some examples of early forays into what's happening already that I think through this year will gather steam to start to offer solutions to this endemic problem. I'll finish by saying, let's also touch upon the fact that AI might have a negative impact on climate change, and let's talk about that later on.
No, thank you so much. And I think it's very important to also realize that considering the where we are right now, the importance of these technologies get more increased because of the same fact the way we are seeing the effects getting increased of climate change. So, and Aditya, would you, while we start talking about these recent technologies, would you also want to touch upon that? Do these technologies have effect on mitigation, adaptation, resilience likewise? Or do you think these technologies could help in one particular way more and the other less?
So I think they have applications across all sides of responding to climate change, spanning mitigation and adaptation. But Anirudh, to be absolutely honest, I'm on thin ice, no pun intended, when it comes to mitigation. So I'm going to restrict myself to talking about adaptation in this conversation.
Yeah. So can we dive right deep into it and understand from your perspective that how do you see AI, machine learning, big data helping in adaptation efforts? And maybe once you've set the stage, then we can deep dive into the questions and some of the pitfalls that you see.
Sure. What we've seen over the last 5 years in particular is a massive growth in incredible experiments that have helped us determine the degree to which these new technologies can help us in understanding risk from a macro to a micro scale. And my own research, I found some very powerful examples of how these new technologies are being used to understand vulnerability, which is the innate susceptibility of people to being affected by climate impacts in a much more clear, granular way. And vulnerability is traditionally and historically been quite difficult to determine, quite expensive to determine. At the same time, these new technologies are helping us understand who is exposed to climate impacts more or less than others. And exposure, very simply, is if your house is in the path of a hurricane, you have a high degree of exposure to the hurricane. But determining who is in the path of which kind of climate hazard isn't always simple and straightforward. And thirdly, these new technologies are very useful in us understanding how hazards might evolve, which and hazards are the extreme events that take place or the creeping changes that take place to erode our well-being and our quality of living. Cyclones, desertification, floods are all examples of hazards, and together with hazards, exposure, and vulnerability, I'm arguing that these new technologies provide us with a comprehensive suite of mechanisms to accurately determine risk at different scales.
Aditya, would you delve a little bit deeper into determining first risk? And then, second, I'm also curious because at some points of time, technology seems to be also a quick fix solution because, in the end, like we still could say that yes, it's a hurricane pathway, but at the end of the day, there needs to be some action that needs to be taken on ground. So, I mean, having said that, technology also needs to marry the locally led efforts wherein these two could go hand in hand.
Let me begin with this point and then go on to the other points. I completely agree with you. And in my book, I'm very clear to underline that in no way am I what is the phrase now? Techno optimist. I don't think technology is the sole solution to all our endemic problems. I feel like it offers us some very powerful tools that need to be complemented with other ways of thinking, other ways of decision making, and allows us to illuminate a pathway to a more climate resilient world. It isn't an answer in itself. With that slightly wishy-washy caveat, I might go on to answering your first question. Um, so I think it's best illustrated with a few examples, right? When it comes to vulnerability, which is the innate susceptibility of people and their capacity to adapt to climate change, traditionally, how has this been done? It's been done using either by using quite complex participatory approaches that require a high degree of training in people who are running them. They're quite expensive. They require time from the people running the exercises, the communities who are running them. Uh, and so, in every case, it may not be judicious or possible, especially in cases of emergency, to kind of try and determine vulnerability using these participatory approaches. The second very widely used approach is surveys, where you go house to house, ask people about the assets that they have, the savings that they have, the capabilities that they have, and try and use this data as a proxy for determining how vulnerable people are. Again, quite useful, but quite expensive, quite time consuming. I think these new technologies offer us tools that might help us circumvent some of these methods in certain cases where it's needed, or in other cases help us complement the data that we get from participatory exercises and survey methods with other kinds of data. To give you one very clear example, in East Africa, a very unique experiment took place between a startup and a big international organization where they were trying to understand who is vulnerable most to food insecurity. Particularly difficult question to ask in remote parts of East Africa. And one of the solutions that they came up was to use mobile airtime top up recharge data as a proxy for food vulnerability at the household level. Let me unpack that very simply. I mean, I can put more information in the links, but they found through real world calibration that if a particular household was topping up their cell phone for less than a particular threshold amount, say $5 a month, you could say with a high degree of statistical certainty that they're not consuming the right amount of calories. So, through this method, now what this enables you is to crowdsource anonymized call detail records for particular geographical areas and determine with a fair degree of confidence that these households are food insecure. Let's parachute in some support and some food aid, in as opposed to sending in enumerators who are going to conduct time-consuming long-term household surveys to then arrive at a solution which may come to vulnerable communities later than needed. So, like this is one like illustrative example of a large number of other examples also that are helping us tackle vulnerability. I'll give you one quick example of exposure as well. Um, so one of the problems with determining exposure is highly variegated, especially in urban contexts, right? Um, where you may say, okay, that slum settlement is vulnerable to flooding, but all of us know that within the slum, certain kinds of people will be more vulnerable and less vulnerable. So, volunteer geographic information systems are demonstrating the potential to fill these gaps. What happened in Dar es Salaam was this group did extremely high resolution drone photography of a flood exposed slum settlement. And that drone photography was then used to make very precise maps of the slum settlement, which are very difficult to come by because slums don't exist in any official, in any official documentation in the city. Then they use those maps as the starting point for participatory exercises, where people living in the slums could look at these very precise maps and say, okay, that's where this old family lives that doesn't have the capacity to respond if a flood comes. This is where community infrastructure is, which isn't shown in any map. If that gets flooded, then all of us don't have fresh water. So in these ways, complementing new technologies with existing ways of new things offers incredibly new potential for solving endemic problems. And then to finish up on hazards, which is my favorite example, save as my best example for the last, is again, I'm an urbanist, right? A lot of my work is focused on looking at urban resilience issues. And one of the big climate impacts in cities is heat. Heat is going to become more and more of a problem. But determining how hot which part of a city is going to be is very difficult because this varies block by block, street by street, depends on how tall the buildings are, how much glass is being used, how many trees there are, how wide the roads are, what color the roads are, how broad the pavements are, etc., etc. And therefore, you can never really know which part of a city is going to be worse affected than heat than others. And this startup in America, what they figured out was that every Android phone in the world is constantly monitoring its own battery temperature. Because Android phones have a tendency to explode if their charging and the batteries reach a particular temperature threshold. So they cut off the charging mechanism before the batteries become too hot. So what that phone's actually doing is collecting battery temperature data 24/7 as whenever your phone is on. So what these guys did is again through real world calibration figured out a relationship between air temperature and battery temperature, finding that if the battery is at say 10 degrees and the air temperature is at 7 degrees. And now what they have is 500,000 thermometers spread across America's cities that are providing real-time information on air temperature to them 24/7. And this not only tells you what the air temperature is there and then, over time, it allows you to predict heat hazards much more effectively, where you can say, based on past patterns and modeling, we can determine that if in New York there were 3 days of 28 degrees centigrade in the third week of June, we can say fairly certainly that the second week of July is going to bring a big heat wave.
Very fascinating, Aditya. And I think a lot of times we tend to look at these big terms from the perspective of also coming from a place of skepticism. But I think it's very important to realize that how these small examples are making impact. Would you also want to take a second, because whenever I used to come across research, one aspect of socio-economic stressors was always something that came to be missing from artificial intelligence's ability to be intelligent about, So maybe if you could tell a little bit, if at all, these aspect, which of course happens to be a big aspect in vulnerability determination, could be integrated while we are dealing with these technological aspects, or if there are some real world examples that are dealing with it.
Absolutely. So, just to be clear, I did my PhD at the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex, which is the home of participatory development, the place where Robert Chambers, who pioneered participatory approaches in international development, lives and works. And so I too approach this whole debate from a point of intense skepticism. However, felt after engaging with the material that there is a need for us to be a bit more accepting and a bit more accommodating. And particularly to answer your question on the socio-economic data, again, I found examples that are trying to focus on those aspects using new technologies as well. Again, indulge me, I'm going to talk you through two examples which again blew my mind. One was in the Gulf of Mexico. Sorry, not the Gulf of Mexico, the Pacific coast of Mexico, which sees cyclone activity from time to time. And what they did was to try and determine economic vulnerability to these cyclone events. When a cyclone was approaching landfall, they started to track point of sales information, which is the machines and shops where you put your card, and ATM withdrawal information from this particular city that was right in the path of the cyclone. And through that, they were able to get large amounts of very precise data on who is buying what in which parts of the city. And through that, they could actually develop a graded map of who has adaptive capacity. And who doesn't. So, in particular neighborhoods, they found that people were buying toilet paper, people were buying flashlights, people buying batteries, people buying generators, people buying medicines. In others, they found that people were just focusing on basic food grains and not being able to buy anything at all. In certain parts of the city, they found heightened ATM withdrawal activity because people were trying to hoard cash to prepare for upheaval, and in others they didn't find the similar this thing. So it indicated to them, who has the capacity to withstand and bounce back and adapt to this particular hazard event, and who doesn't. So I really feel like I feel like I feel like yes, participatory approaches may provide you a more granular understanding of particular power dynamics at a local level that are critically important in people's adaptive capacity. But I would not say that new technologies overlook these highly granular socio-economic parameters that also help us build a picture of who can withstand climate-induced hazards and who cannot.
Aditya, would you say, I mean, of course, there's so much merit in all of these technologies, and in the previous podcast, I had Christina who talked about early warnings for all. And, and there I was introduced to this idea of how pivotal it is to just prevent millions and millions of people who are at the risk of being affected by the climate change effects. But I'm also wondering, while we have all of these examples, do you see enough traction to adopt them at scale? If not, why? And where do you see the trends going?
Um, Good question. So yeah, I mean, I completely agree with Christina. I'm a big fan of her thinking and her work. And I'm glad she mentioned early warning for all. I work currently, as you said in your introduction, with the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center, and the Red Cross International Red Cross is a part of the Early Warning for All initiative, and there our Secretary General always emphasizes that our approach spans from satellites to sandbags, which is a catchy way of communicating that we not only focus on the technology and the forecasting and the modeling, but we also support action on the ground. So, again, I'll caveat this by saying that any effort requires a whole array of interventions. Uh, to answer your question specifically, I feel like, yes, we are there. These new technologies are available, are cost effective, are fairly easy to use, but there is path dependency. A lot of us who've grown up in an analog world where many of these technologies were not available to us aren't trained uh, and aren't fully sensitized to how to adopt them, how to use them, how to mainstream them in our work. And that is a challenge that we have to embrace as opposed to kind of repudiating these new technologies and continuing with the way that we do things. Again, I'm not saying that give up what we were doing and adopt these new ways. I'm saying find ways of melding the old and the new to find more and more precise understandings of risk. Now, on the issue of early warning in particular, again, I think there are lots of interesting examples, and I won't bore you with more, but very generally, a lot of the examples on the use of new technology for early warnings, what it allows you to do is meld information from different sources to build a holistic picture of what may be coming. So in one particular example that I studied, this platform is able to use climate modeling, satellite imaging, ground-based weather information, and information from other kinds of forecasts, and then kind of using their own algorithms, bring it all together to determine quite a precise picture of what might happen, and also send out, in this particular example, warnings to farmers about what might be coming using SMSs. So, like, I really feel in almost every facet of climate action, there is a potential for the adoption for of these new technologies and for them to complement what we were already doing.
Aditya, do you see? I was reading about black box effect,
Mm.
the fact that if, for example, I do not understand a particular technology well, there's also a very big pitfall of me misusing it in some way or the other because I don't understand what's being fed into the models. So, for example, if in the case of early warnings for all, the way we are talking about, as a practitioner, as a policymaker, or even as someone who's implementing efforts on ground, as you very well said, that it's an effort between it's both ways. So, do you think there is merit in this argument that not only with respect to education but also with respect to how there's a pitfall of not understanding the concept fully because we don't know what's going into the models at first place, and then being left with something that we cannot fully understand and then not fully implement.
I mean, I agree with you. That's definitely part of the challenge. But I feel like we need to take that up as a call to arms, right? As opposed to feeling like this is something that we can't engage with. I feel like all of us who kind of engaging in this space have the ability, the mental faculty to wrap our heads around this. It's the inclination and it's the effort that I feel like we need to make to adopt and mainstream these new technologies. Otherwise, we'll find ourselves being displaced by a new kind of climate actor that is able to use these tools. So I feel like for us to continue to be relevant, to deliver the services that we are mandated to do by our organizational charters, we absolutely must try and train ourselves and engage with these new technologies. And there are so many avenues available out there for us to do this effectively, cheaply, so that we are able to grapple with this, to use a cliche, brave new world that is unfolding around all of us now.
So, Aditya, now that we're convinced about the possibilities that we have of using this technology and to be able to achieve results at scale, can you discuss one such technology, one such promising area where you think it holds promise with respect to dealing with the crisis, or maybe one area wherein you could nudge anyone to look at wherein we could achieve results at scale?
Yeah, absolutely, Anirudh. I think that's a Great question. There are lots of answers to that question. I'm going to try and limit myself to one kind of type of technology, uh, which has unfolded in the last, I would say, 15, 20, 10 years actually, maybe 15 years, 10 years, which is now a large number of people across the global south all carry an extremely powerful computer in their pockets at all times. And I feel like the use of user generated information through mobile phones, I feel can be used in lots of very interesting ways to deal with the climate crisis. I've already given you two examples, one of the airtime top up information for food security, another one about battery temperature, air temperature. But mobile phones are being used in all kinds of different ways. I was part of a remarkable initiative which is funded by the UK government, where we're trying to build resilience of local communities in Myanmar. And what we did was, instead of traditional monitoring and evaluation to determine the impact that we had, we tried to use mobile phones to understand the impact that our program was having on the lives of people. And simply what this entailed was sending mobile phone based surveys to a large number of project beneficiaries and them responding to us. Sometimes for small incentives like airtime top up, small amounts of airtime top up, sometimes just because they were part of the project area. And through that, we were able to get fairly granular information on how the project was impacting their ability to anticipate, absorb, and adapt to different kind of climate induced shocks and stresses. And we were able to do this, Anirudh, almost in a quasi impact evaluation approach, where we were able to try and understand how they were faring before a climate event and after a climate event, to see how their well-being, their consumption might have gone up or down as a result of climate change. And some of the pioneering work done by my colleagues Lindsay Jones and Tom Tanner, do look them up, kind of indicates how these mobile phone based technologies can be used in these ways. In another in another example from Bangladesh, and this is happening in many countries, mobile phone data is being used to understand migration and distress migration much more accurately than before, because through a mobile phone you can get an understanding of who is moving where. If a cyclone hits a particular area, what happens to migratory patterns, to really make sure that we can design programs and approaches that can help displaced people better in the context of climate change. Because as the climate crisis worsens, that's also going to have a deleterious impact on migration. So yeah, I mean, if I was to limit myself to one type of technology, I would say mobile phones provide an answer or a partial answer to a large number of questions that we all have.
This makes me think, like we say that data is the new gold. I mean, we could also, I just had in my mind, data could also be the new medicine. I mean,
Yeah, yeah,
who knows
very
if
true.
if you were to put it that way. Aditya, this was great getting to know about the examples and understanding what promise you see with these technologies. Before we wrap up the call, what I try and do is understand from every practitioner's perspective a call to action, to different stakeholders with which you could summarize maybe how better could things be, and how which could be to general practitioners, policymakers, uh, people like yourself who are working in organizations, with which maybe we could use AI and big data, machine learning, and other aspects of it to help tackle the crisis. That would be great.
Absolutely. So I'm just going to repeat something that I already said through this conversation, which is it's a challenge to people like myself to learn more about and upskill ourselves in the use of these technologies for supporting the most vulnerable communities across the world. That would be, I think, a short call to action. However, I do want to underline again before we end that new technologies are not the complete answer. Uh, we have to be mindful of some of the pitfalls, right? They're not a silver bullet. Some of the world's most climate vulnerable areas are also the places where there's least amount of internet bandwidth, which poses some challenges for capturing at least big data. The other thing is there can be sampling biases, especially if in an over reliance on mobile phone data. Um, sometimes in trying to collect all this data, we might forget, and I think this is where we started the conversation, we might forget that that data has to be usefully deployed in policy and decision making. So let's not lose focus of the fact that we have to kind of cater to an entire decision making cycle, not just the data collection part of it. And thirdly, there will inevitably be some equity concerns and concerns about the degree to which we can provide kind of granular, locally variegated, high resolution information that really benefits the people who need it most. So, with these caveats, if we keep these caveats in mind, I would be confident that we can find an approach to meld the new with the old to find highly impactful solutions to some endemic problems and solve the climate crisis.
Thank you so much, Aditya, for your time and for this compelling call to action. I believe it's amply clear that it's not a one size fits all solution, as we say in every possible case. We have to look at these things together, and hopefully, we can make good use of these technologies that are there and help provide where it's needed the most. Thank you so much for your time,
Thank you,
Aditya.
Anirudh.
Thank you.